And thanks to At Home for joining us this hour. On Sunday night, this past weekend, police made an arrest, sort of a high-profile arrest, after a flight landed from Central America at LAX, at Los Angeles International Airport. It was a 28-year-old American man who is the leader of a violent white supremacist gang in California, according to California law enforcement. According to people familiar with this case who spoke to the New York Times on condition of anonymity, this 28-year-old U.S. man, had fled from the United States across the southern border into Mexico to try to evade U.S. law enforcement once he knew they were trying to arrest him. He then fled further south to one or more Central American countries. But then, under circumstances that have not yet been explained, the way the New York Times put it is, quote, he was later brought back to the United States. He was brought? Really? Who brought him? In any case, cops were waiting for him when he landed, and they arrested him at LAX on Sunday night. Now, the criminal complaint in his case, in which he and other members of his violent white supremacist group in California are charged with rioting and conspiracy to riot. We got a copy of the criminal complaint against him and his fellow group members once he was arraigned. The criminal complaint in his case names him first, then it names 3 other people who were also part of his violent group. As I mentioned, the leader of the group was picked up Sunday night at Los Angeles Airport. By Wednesday morning this week, they'd got 2 of the other 3 guys named in this criminal complaint as well. One of them was apparently picked up without incident. The other one they got apparently fled up a tree when he learned that he was the subject of this arrest warrant. According to the LA Times, that man spent the night in a friend's treehouse. Turns out being in a tree doesn't make you invisible. Ask a squirrel who lives near a dog. When police found him in the treehouse, he fled first on a bike. And then when that didn't work, he fled on foot, and eventually cops tackled him and took him into custody. So of the 4 members of that violent gang who are named in this criminal complaint, the leader of the gang is now in custody. 2 of the other 3 men named in this criminal complaint are also now in custody. One of them remains at large. His name is Aaron Eason, E-A-S-O-N. He's 38 years old, last known address Riverside County, California, but the cops are hunting him now. Now, the arrest, the indictment of those 4 members, special agent whose affidavit is the basis for this criminal complaint. And he's talking here about information that was obtained using a search warrant off of the cell phone of another member of this violent group who's now in custody. Quote, based on my review of the contents of Daley's cell phone, I know that later on March 25th, 2017, so later on the day of the Make America Great Again pro-Trump rally, Daley sent a text message to another member of the group stating, quote, front page of the Stormer, we did it, fam. Quote, based on my training and experience, I know that the Daily Stormer is a news website and online community forum that is well known among neo-Nazis and white supremacy extremists, which published an article after the Huntington Beach event titled, quote, Trumpenkriegers physically remove Antifa homos in Huntington Beach. And then footnote 3, go down to footnote 3. It says, again, this is the FBI agent's affidavit. Quote, based on my training and experience, I know that Trumpenkriegers is intended to mean fighters for Trump. Based on my review of the contents of Bowman's Facebook account, another alleged member of the group, I know that Bowman posted the Daily Stormer article on his Facebook page along with the comment, quote, we did it, fam. So this is a California-based group. At least 7 of whose members and its leader have now been arrested just this month. It does appear that law enforcement is basically sort of wrapping up this violent group. Lots of the guys in this particular California-based pro-Trump right-wing violent group, they already had criminal records, including the leader. If they didn't have criminal records before, it seems like they're all about to now, because they're all getting arrested and charged now in federal court. Again, 7 of those guys arrested thus far, including their leader just this week. That's West Coast. On the East Coast, in the past week or so, we have also seen the arrests of a similar number of a similar group that also prides itself on its support for President Trump and equally in taking great pleasure in beating people up whenever and wherever they can. And again, you've probably seen in a news context some of this dramatic footage of this East Coast right-wing violent group swarming people and stomping them and kicking them and beating people up on a New York City sidewalk. Since this happened a couple of weeks ago, this dramatic and somewhat intimidating footage has given way to the much less dramatic and much more satisfying footage of all of these guys tidying up and pretending to be remorseful and standing there before a judge in court after being arrested. So far, New York police have issued 9 arrest warrants for the members of this violent pro-Trump group on the East Coast. 6 of the 9 of them have been arrested already. It sort of feels like a new one is coming in every day. Pity the poor barber who had to clean this guy up. Whew. But you know, it's interesting. This whole incident, all of these East Coast arrests related to that gang violence footage from the streets, what that was all about in New York, what the whole occasion for that spectacle in New York City was a repeat invitation to that violent group's leader to speak at the Metro, where pro-Trump right-wing groups came out in the streets of Portland, Oregon to brawl with people who were there to protest against them. Law enforcement officials announced last week that they found a cache of weapons, a large number of long guns that were stashed by that right-wing group in a parking garage overlooking the scene of that protest ahead of that fight, which took place on August 2nd. Law enforcement officials made that announcement this past Monday, the 15th of October, about this stockpile of guns that they had found associated with this group that they were now willing to basically give a public warning about in terms of people having altercations with that group. Hey, you may think they're out there to, break people's noses and club people in the streets. They've also been stockpiling weapons at overview points over places where they know they're going to fight. So that public warning issued by law enforcement in Oregon on Monday, last Monday, the 15th. The very next day after that press conference in Oregon, the head of that right-wing group, the one that law enforcement was warning about with having the guns overlooking their fighting positions, the head of that group was invited onto the Fox News channel in prime time to promote his group and to promote their approach towards supporting President Trump in the streets. There have always been violent extremist groups on the ragged edge of American politics, right? Anti-abortion extremists who turn to bombs and snipers to kill people to try to get their way, to kill doctors, right? Left-wing groups in the 70s who carried out bombings of their own and hijackings, even prison breaks. Puerto Rican separatist groups shot up the U.S. Capitol in the 1950s. More or less modern iterations of the Klan persist to this day. And violent cults and sovereign citizens. Violent extremism, people who celebrate violence for its political effect, they have always been with us in this country. Or at least they've always been off to the side of us, right? They're here, but they're usually way off the number line in terms of what counts as normal American politics. Right now, though, we are experiencing something a little bit different, which is that we are now seeing the formation of new groups, aggressive groups, that recruit aggressively and that openly celebrate violence as their MO. But in their case, whatever else is extreme about their message and their mission and how they see themselves, with these groups, what is new is that they also completely ally themselves with the center of power in mainstream American politics. They celebrate violence, right? In any other era, they would be seen as fringe extremists. But in this era, they see themselves as protectors and promoters of the sitting president of the United States. And they believe that beating people up in the streets is a great way to support him. And that capacity for and desire for violence in the streets is the thing they most aggressively promote about themselves, right? We're the Trumpenkriegers. I'm sure that doesn't even translate. I'm sure that means like, Trump donut or Trump bassinet, right? But what they want it to mean, and the way they build up each other is, make America great again, get your Trump flag on a Trump flagpole, use it to beat the hell out of somebody, then post the video on YouTube and recruit people to your group, showing them how awesome you're being, kicking the crap out of people for the president. Before the beatings on the street outside the Metropolitan Republican Club in New York a couple of weeks ago, this was the case that group's founder made during his invited speech inside addressing Manhattan Republicans.
At the very least, people of the right, let us scum in. You need us foot soldiers. We have a lot in common, and what we have in common is we both want America to prosper. We both want Trump to do well.
The more you know about the long, depressing history of violent extremism in this country, the more clear it is how weird it is right now. That right now we've got new violent extremist groups marketing themselves as foot soldiers for the sitting president of the United States. I mean, we've always had violent extremism. We've always had presidential politics of, varying levels of intelligence and combativeness. But we've never had violent extremist groups saying that what they're doing is on behalf of the president. With this president, that is what we've got. Now, a couple of things. Both of these East Coast groups and West Coast violent groups, the California-based group and these guys who you saw on the streets of New York, right after coming out of the Republican group where they said, you need us, we're all in support of Trump together, aren't we? And then they walk outside and have their brawl in the streets. The West Coast group in California, the East Coast group you saw in New York, both of them have clearly been infiltrated by law enforcement and are starting to get broken up. At least 6 arrests in one group, with more certainly to come, at least 7 arrests in the other group, including their leader. It turns out when you commit crimes and video yourself doing it and then set it to music and put it online, to a federal prosecutor, that's pretty much the equivalent of you tying a bow on yourself, wrapping yourself up in pretty paper and tucking yourself under the tree. These guys are not necessarily geniuses, right? And so maybe it is not a surprise that we have seen them start to get wrapped up by federal prosecutors with these multiple arrest warrants, these multiple indictments. And along these same lines, frankly, as we expected, today's headlines all day were dominated by the quick and decisive end to this storyline we've been through all week, wherein an apparently mad bomber has been targeting President Trump's favorite targets for his invective with pipe bombs sent through the mail. After the arrest of a suspect in the case this morning, prosecutors in their criminal complaint described 13 separate pipe bombs that he created and sent to prominent Democrats and other people who've been criticized by President Trump and by conservative media. By tonight, the number of devices associated with this string of bombings appears to have risen even from today's criminal complaint, risen from 13 to 14. Law enforcement officials confirming that billionaire anti-climate change activist and Trump critic Tom Steyer has also been targeted with one of these devices. I mean, once we started to see the amount of physical evidence that this bomber was leaving behind like breadcrumbs in a trail, it seemed likely that they were going to get it, and quickly. And thanks to the FBI and the postal inspectors and the ATF and the NYPD and the Secret Service and all the other law enforcement agencies involved here, the arrest did come fairly quickly. He is apparently not talking to prosecutors, but in the criminal complaint, the FBI describes the means by which they identified him, which includes both DNA evidence and latent fingerprints that he left behind on more than one of these devices that he allegedly sent out. So we will see where his case goes, right? His case is a matter for the criminal justice system now. And we, of course, are waiting to find out if there are more devices that are out there. Remember, another one arrived after the criminal complaint against this guy was filed. Are there more devices out there that haven't been discovered yet? Right? There's intriguing questions that we still don't know the answer to, like, did he act alone? Very practical questions to ask, like, where did he build these bombs? Since he seems to have lived in his van, which I'm sure is a very nice place to live, but it's probably not an ideal place to both live and make more than a dozen live pipe bombs. So where did he make the bombs? In there? Really? Crowded. But the circumstances of his arrest and the decoration of that van, and what is known about him so far by open source reporting today and by the social media postings that are described by the FBI in their criminal complaint against him, what we can now tell, what we now have to figure out what to do with as a country and as a democracy, is the fact that he clearly seems to be a Trump superfan, right? And criminals and terrorists and unhinged mad bombers who live in vans are allowed to have any political views that they want. They're allowed to be fans or critics of anyone in public life. That does not necessarily impugn or even reflect on those public figures about whom said nutball might have had strong feelings. But we are also in a historically unique time in which this particular president and his brand of Trumpism, for lack of a better term, in the Republican Party, it has inspired violent offshoot movements in a way that we haven't seen other presidents do, ever. Yes, there's always violent extremism in America. We don't see violent extremist movements springing up to support the sitting president. Right? So how do we defend ourselves as a country from what would be a new type of threat, right? Neither violent extremism nor contentious presidential politics are new things in our country. But when those things dovetail together, that potentially poses a danger to our country that may be bigger than just the additive force of those two things combined. They may not just add, they may multiply. And this is a new kind of threat for us. And so anyone, through whatever warped lens, who was looking to do Trump's bidding by not just verbally attacking, but literally attacking, literally threatening the lives of Trump's declared enemies. I mean, it matters in this environment that such a person in such a mindset wouldn't find it difficult to put together a target list for who that person would want to send his bombs to, right? It's not exactly been a subtle thing in Trump world.
ISIS is honoring President Obama. He is the